She asked her father why they were laughing at her dress. He did not answer with words. He answered with a document that made grown men weep by sunset. Welcome to Shadow of the West. Subscribe and ring the bell for more legendary tales of love, courage, and the untamed frontier. There is a kind of laughter that does not celebrate joy. It cuts, it marks, it leaves scars on the inside where no one can see them heal or fail to heal. In the Montana Territory of 1873, laughter was often the cruelest weapon carried by men who had everything and feared losing it to men who had nothing and feared no one. The town of Bitter Springs sat in a valley where the railroad had planted its iron roots and grown a forest of wealth around them. Hotels with painted signs, a bank with marble steps, a mercantile that sold French perfume and canned oysters shipped from San Francisco. The people who lived in the fine houses on the hill wore clothes that had never touched dirt. They walked on boardwalks built above the mud. They drank imported wine and spoke about the frontier as if it were something they had conquered rather than something they had purchased. At the edge of town, where the boardwalk ended and the mud began, stood a girl and her father. The girl's name was Rose. She was 8 years old. Her dress had been mended so many times, the original fabric was difficult to identify beneath the patches. Her boots were too large. Hand-me-downs from a boy who had outgrown them, or died in them. It was impossible to know which. Her hair was long and dark, and tangled, pulled back with a piece of leather cord, because ribbon cost money, and money was something her father saved for flour and salt, and the other quiet necessities that kept a person alive when the world offered no assistance. Her father's name was Nathaniel Cade. He was 41 years old and looked 60. His face was weathered the way stone is weathered, not softly, not gracefully, but honestly, by wind and sun, and years of looking directly at things other men turned away from. He wore skins, not because he preferred them, because cloth wore out and skins lasted, and lasting mattered more than appearance when you lived 3 days' ride from the nearest town in a cabin you built with your own hands from. Trees you felled yourself on land no one wanted until you made it want you back. He was a mountain man, a trapper, a man who spoke more often to his horse than to humans. He came to Bitter Springs twice a year, spring and fall, to trade pelts for supplies and disappear back into the wilderness where silence was the only neighbor and solitude the only law. This trip was different. He had brought Rose. Her mother had died that winter, quietly, the way frontier women often died, worn down by work and cold and the slow arithmetic of a body that had given everything and had nothing left to negotiate with. Nathaniel had buried her on a hill above their cabin, beneath a pine tree that would outlive them both, and he had made a decision. Rose needed to see the world beyond the mountains. She needed to know that people existed, that towns existed, that life could be something other than snow and firewood and the sound of her father's axe against frozen timber. So he brought her to Bitter Springs. He walked her down the main street. He held her hand, and the people on the boardwalk stopped and stared, not with curiosity, with contempt. Rose did not understand it at first. She thought they were looking at the buildings, at the painted signs, at the dresses in the shop windows that shimmered like something from a storybook she had never read, because books did not exist in the world she came from. But then she heard the laughter. Low at first, then louder, then open and unashamed. A woman in a green silk dress leaned toward another woman and whispered something behind her gloved hand. Both of them laughed. A man in a fine coat wrinkled his nose as Nathaniel and Rose passed, as if their presence had introduced a smell that offended the carefully perfumed air of the boardwalk. A boy, no older than 12, dressed in clothes worth more than Nathaniel earned in a year, pointed at Rose's boots and said something to his friends. They all laughed. Rose tightened her grip on her father's hand. She looked up at him. His face had not changed. He walked steadily, calmly, as if the laughter did not exist, but Rose felt it. She felt every eye, every whisper, every curl of a lip, every shift of a shoulder that turned away as if her very presence was something to be avoided. They reached the mercantile. Nathaniel opened the door. The bell above it rang. Inside, the store smelled like leather and tobacco, and something sweet Rose could not identify. The clerk behind the counter looked up. His expression shifted from professional courtesy to something colder. He did not say welcome. He did not smile. He simply waited. Nathaniel placed his list on the counter. Flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, ammunition, fabric for a winter coat Rose would need when the cold returned, and her current one, already too small, would no longer keep her warm. The clerk read the list without comment. He began gathering the items with an efficiency that suggested he wanted this transaction to end as quickly as possible. While Nathaniel settled the payment, Rose wandered toward the back of the store, where bolts of fabric leaned against the wall, in colors she had never seen in the mountains. Blue like deep water, red like a sunset her mother used to watch from the cabin door. Yellow like the flowers that grew near the creek in summer. She reached out to touch one, not to take it, just to feel it, to know what softness like that felt like against skin that knew only wool and rough-spun cotton. "Don't touch that." The voice was sharp, female. Rose pulled her hand back, as if the fabric had burned her. A woman stood near the counter, not old, not young, dressed in a lavender dress with lace at the collar. Her hair was arranged in a style that required time and mirrors, and a life that had both. She was looking at Rose the way people look at stray dogs that wander too close to the table during dinner. "She's filthy," the woman said, not to Rose, to the clerk, as if Rose could not hear. As if Rose was not standing 3 feet away, small and still, and holding her breath. The clerk nodded. He said nothing. He did not need to. The silence was agreement enough. Nathaniel turned. Slowly. He looked at the woman. He looked at the clerk. He looked at his daughter, standing near the bolts of fabric with her hand still half raised, frozen in the air, like a question she did not know how to finish asking. He walked to her. He knelt down. He placed his hand on her shoulder, gently, the way he did everything with her, as if she were made of something precious and breakable that the world had already tried to damage, and he was determined not to add to the harm. "We're done here," he said quietly. They left the store. The bell rang again. Behind them, Rose heard the woman say something to the clerk. She did not hear the words, only the tone, only the laughter that followed. Outside, the boardwalk was crowded, men in fine hats, women in dresses that swept the wood without touching the dirt below, children in shoes that had never been worn by someone else first. They all stopped and looked. Some of them whispered. Some of them did not bother to whisper. Rose felt her father's hand tighten slightly on her shoulder. Not hard, just firm. just enough to remind her he was there, that she was not alone, that whatever these people were, whatever they thought, it did not change what she was. It did not change what he was. It did not change the fact that they had walked out of the mountains together, and they would walk back into them the same way. But then a man stepped forward. He was tall, well-dressed. His coat was tailored, his boots polished, his hat expensive. He had the kind of face that was used to being listened to, the kind of presence that expected deference and usually received it. His name was Howard Griffith. He owned the bank. He owned the hotel. He owned half the buildings on the street and most of the land the railroad ran through. He was the wealthiest man in Bitter Springs. Some said the wealthiest man in the territory. He looked at Nathaniel, then at Rose, then back at Nathaniel, and he smiled, not warmly, not kindly, the way a man smiles when he is about to say something he knows will hurt, and he does not care. "You brought your daughter to town," Griffith said. His voice was loud enough for everyone on the boardwalk to hear, loud enough to be a performance. How rustic. Laughter rippled through the crowd, small at first, then louder, encouraged by his tone, by his confidence, by the fact that Howard Griffith could say anything in Bitter Springs, and no one would challenge him, because challenging Howard Griffith meant challenging the man who held the mortgages on their homes and the deeds to their businesses. Nathaniel said nothing. He simply stood there, his hand still on Rose's shoulder, his face still calm, still unreadable. Griffith took a step closer. He looked down at Rose with exaggerated concern. "Does she always smell like animals? Or is today special?" The laughter grew. Open now. Unrestrained. Men joined in, women behind their fans. Even some of the children, mimicking the adults, not understanding the cruelty, but learning it quickly. Because cruelty, like language, is something children absorb from the world around them. Rose looked up at her father. Her eyes were wide, confused, hurt in a way she did not have words for yet. And she asked the question that would break something in Nathaniel Cade that had never been broken before. Not by war, not by loss, not by 30 years of surviving in a land that killed softer men. "Papa," she whispered, "why are they laughing?" Nathaniel Cade did not answer immediately. He looked at his daughter, then at the crowd, then at Howard Griffith, who stood smiling in his tailored coat on his polished boardwalk in his purchased town, surrounded by people who had mistaken wealth for worth and cruelty for power. And Nathaniel Cade made a decision, not with anger, not with rage, with the cold, absolute clarity of a man who had just realized that the world his daughter was inheriting needed to be corrected. Not for his sake, for hers. He knelt down beside Rose. He placed both hands on her shoulders. He looked into her eyes, those wide, dark eyes that still held trust, still held love, still held the belief that her father could protect her from anything. "They're laughing," he said quietly, "because they don't know who we are." He stood, he took her hand, and he began to walk, not away, not toward the edge of town where the mud began and the mountains waited. He walked toward the bank, toward the marble steps, toward the building Howard Griffith had built, with money made from men who dug in the earth and bled in the cold, while Griffith sat in rooms with curtains and calculated interest. The crowd watched. The laughter faded. Confusion replaced it, because Nathaniel Cade was walking with purpose, and purpose in a man who had lived alone in the wilderness for decades, was a dangerous thing. He reached the bank. He climbed the steps. He opened the door. Inside, clerks looked up from their desks. A manager stepped forward, ready to ask what business a man in animal skins could possibly have in a place like this. Nathaniel reached into his coat. He pulled out a leather pouch, worn, stained, tied with a cord that had been tied and untied 1,000 times. He opened it, and from inside he pulled a folded piece of paper, old, yellowed, but still legible, still legal, still binding. He placed it on the counter. He looked at the manager, and he spoke 4 words that would be repeated in Bitter Springs for the next 50 years. I own this land. Silence is a strange thing in a crowded room. It does not arrive gradually. It falls. Complete. Total. Like snow that buries everything beneath it until nothing remains but white and stillness. The manager stared at the document. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. His eyes moved across the words, the legal descriptions, the survey markers, the signatures of territorial officials long dead, the seals that marked this paper as something more than paper, something binding, something true. The document was a land grant, issued in 1858, 15 years earlier. Before the railroad came, before Bitter Springs existed, before Howard Griffith was anything more than a clerk in a saint, more than a clerk in a Saint Louis shipping office, dreaming of wealth he had not yet figured out how to steal. The grant conveyed ownership of 12,000 acres, the valley, the hills, the riverbed, the timber, the mineral rights, everything the town of Bitter Springs sat on, everything the railroad ran through, everything Howard Griffith believed he owned. It had been granted to Nathaniel Cade, for service rendered, for blood given, for surviving what other men did not survive in a war that had ended, but never truly stopped taking from the men who fought it. Nathaniel had never spoken of it. Not to neighbors, not to traders, not to the few people who existed on the periphery of his solitary life. He had taken the land grant and walked into the mountains and built a cabin and lived as if the paper did not exist, as if ownership was something proven by presence, not by documents locked in territorial offices. But the paper existed, legal, recorded, filed in the land office in Helena where no one had thought to look, because no one imagined that a man in animal skins who traded pelts twice a year could own anything more than the 2, rifle on his back and the horse he rode. The manager's face lost its color. He looked up at Nathaniel, then at the door, where the crowd from the boardwalk had begun to gather, drawn by the silence, by the sense that something was happening that would change the shape of the town they thought they understood. Howard Griffith pushed through the crowd. He walked to the counter. He looked at the document. His expression did not change immediately. He was a man trained in controlling his face, in revealing nothing until he had assessed the situation and determined the most advantageous response. He read the document carefully, slowly, and with each line something inside him began to crack. Because Howard Griffith did not own Bitter Springs. He had never owned it. He had built on land he leased from the railroad, which had leased it from the territorial government, which had granted it 15 years ago. In a transaction buried in records no one bothered to review. To the man standing in front of him, holding the hand of a girl in patched clothes and oversized boots, Griffith looked at Nathaniel. For the first time in 20 years, Howard Griffith did not know what to say. He was a man who had built an empire on confidence and contracts and the belief that wealth was its own form of law. But law, actual law, was standing in front of him in the form of a document older and more binding than any contract he had ever signed. "This is Griffith," began, but his voice faltered. He tried again. "This must be fraudulent." "It's not," the manager said quietly. He was still holding the paper. His hands were shaking. "I've seen the territorial records. This grant is registered. Legal, binding." Griffith's jaw tightened. He looked at the crowd, at the men who worked for him, at the women who shopped in his stores, at the children who would inherit the town he thought he had built, and he saw in their faces the beginning of something he had never seen before. Doubt, the first crack in the belief that Howard Griffith was untouchable. Nathaniel had not moved. He stood at the counter with his daughter beside him. Rose was looking up at her father. She did not understand the paper. She did not understand the words, but she understood the silence. She understood that something had changed, that the laughter had stopped, that the people who had mocked her were now staring at her father with expressions she could not read, but recognized as fear. Nathaniel looked at Griffith. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, calm, the voice of a man who had no need to raise it, because he was not arguing. He was stating fact. "You built a town on my land," Nathaniel said, "without asking, without paying. You laid railroad tracks across my timber. You dug foundations in my earth. You sold parcels you never owned. You collected rents on buildings, sitting on ground that was never yours to lease." Griffith said nothing. His hands were clenched at his sides. His face was red, not with embarrassment, with rage. The rage of a man who had spent 20 years constructing an identity as the wealthiest, most powerful person in the territory, only to discover that his power was built on a foundation of paper he had never bothered to verify. "I could evict you," Nathaniel continued. Still quiet, still calm. "Every building, every business, every home. I could reclaim this land and leave you with nothing but the memory of what you thought you owned." The crowd shifted. Whispers began. Panic in some voices, disbelief in others. The manager set the document down carefully, as if it might explode. "But I won't," Nathaniel said. The whispers stopped. Griffith looked up sharply. "I don't want your town," Nathaniel said. "I never did. I came here for supplies. I came here so my daughter could see that the world is bigger than the mountains. I came here so she would know that people exist, that civilization exists." He paused. His eyes moved across the crowd, across the faces that had laughed, that had whispered, that had looked at his daughter as if she were something dirty, something less. "But you laughed at her," Nathaniel said. And now, for the first time, there was something in his voice that was not calm, not rage, grief. The grief of a father who had tried to give his daughter a gift, the gift of the wider world, and watched that world reject her with cruelty so casual it did not even recognize itself as cruel. "You mocked her," he continued. "You treated her as if her clothes mattered more than her heart, as if her smell mattered more than her soul. You laughed, and she asked me why." Rose tightened her grip on her father's hand. She was crying now, silently, the way children cry when they do not want to be noticed, when they are ashamed of their tears but cannot stop them. Nathaniel knelt beside her. He wiped her face with his rough, calloused hand. He whispered something to her that no one else could hear. Then he stood. He looked at Howard Griffith, and he made his terms. "You will apologize to my daughter," Nathaniel said, publicly, now, in front of everyone who laughed. Griffith's face went white, then red, then white again. "I will do no such, or I will exercise my rights under this grant," Nathaniel interrupted. His voice was still quiet, but there was iron in it now. The iron of a man who had survived alone in the wilderness for 30 years, who had built a life with his hands, who had buried a wife and raised a daughter and asked nothing from the world except to be left alone. And the world had not left him alone. It had laughed at his child. "I will evict every business," Nathaniel said. "I will reclaim every parcel. I will dismantle this town brick by brick and return this valley to the wilderness it was before you arrived. And you, Howard Griffith, will be known as the man who lost an empire because he mocked a little girl." The silence was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall behind the counter, marking seconds that felt like hours. Griffith looked at Rose, at her tear-streaked face, at her patched dress, at the oversized boots, at the father standing beside her with a land grant that could erase everything Griffith had built. And Howard Griffith, the wealthiest man in the territory, the man who had never bent, never apologized, never acknowledged error, knelt down. He knelt on the floor of his own bank, in front of the crowd, in front of the men who worked for him, in front of the women who envied his wife, in front of the children who had laughed because their parents taught them that cruelty toward the powerless was acceptable. He looked at Rose, and he spoke. "I'm sorry." His voice cracked, not with sincerity, with humiliation. But it did not matter. The words were spoken, witnessed, recorded in the memory of everyone present. Nathaniel placed his hand on Rose's shoulder. He nodded to Griffith. He took the land grant from the counter, folded it carefully, and returned it to the leather pouch. Then he walked out of the bank. Rose walked beside him. The crowd parted. No one spoke. No one laughed. They walked down the boardwalk, past the mercantile, past the hotel, past the fine houses on the hill where curtains moved as people watched from windows, too ashamed now to show their faces. At the edge of town where the boardwalk ended and the mud began, Nathaniel stopped. He looked back at Bitter Springs, at the buildings, at the people, at the empire Howard Griffith had built on land that was ever his. Rose looked up at her father. "Papa," she said quietly, "can we go home now?" Nathaniel looked down at her, and for the first time that day, he smiled. Not a big smile, it's just a small one. The kind that belongs to a man who has done what needed doing and can now return to the life he chose. "Yes," he said, "we can go home." They rode into the mountains. The sun set behind them, painting the valley in gold and red. By the time darkness fell, they were gone. And Bitter Springs, wealthy, proud, powerful Bitter Springs, was left to reckon with the fact that its entire existence rested on the mercy of a man in animal skins, who had asked for nothing but respect for his daughter. They say Howard Griffith never recovered. Not financially. He kept his businesses, his buildings, his wealth, but something inside him broke that day. He was never again seen without looking over his shoulder. Never again confident in his ownership, because he had learned what every powerful man eventually learns: that power built on cruelty is power that can be taken away by a single piece of paper and a father's love. And in the mountains, in a cabin built by hand, beneath a pine tree, on a hill, Nathaniel Cade raised his daughter in peace. She grew strong, she grew kind, and she grew up knowing that the world could be cruel. Yes, but that her father had proven something more important: that love, quiet and patient and unshakable, was stronger than any empire, and that sometimes the greatest victories are not won with guns or gold. They are won with 7 words spoken in a bank on an autumn afternoon. "You will apologize to my daughter." And the world, for once, listened.